In the year 2200 BC, in a period that historians call the Early Bronze Age, something happened on this planet that has no satisfactory explanation to this day. It was not a war. It was not a documented epidemic. It was not a volcano or an isolated earthquake. It was something far stranger and far more disturbing than any of those things, because what happened did not happen to one civilization.
How much longer
it
can
happened
we
to all
endure
of them
this?
at the same time. The Akkadian Empire, the first true imperial structure in human history, collapsed. The old kingdom of Egypt, which had built the pyramids and dominated the known world for centuries, collapsed. The cities of the Indus Valley, that extraordinary civilization in what is today Pakistan that had developed drainage systems and urban planning that would not be seen again until the Roman era, collapsed. The cities of Syria, of Anatolia, of Greece, all of them, in the space of less than a century. Virtually everything humanity had built over 3,000 years of civilization crumbled, as if someone had flipped a switch. And the most unsettling part of all is that nobody knows for certain why. That is what we are going to try to understand today. And I guarantee you that when you finish this video, you are going to look at the world we live in a completely different way. Stay until the end, because the last part of this story is the one that should matter most to us today. And if you are interested in the history that explains the present, subscribe now and hit the bell, because this is exactly what we do here every week, and you will not want to miss what is coming. To understand the magnitude of what collapsed in the year 2200 BC, you first have to understand what existed. And what existed was, by the standards of the time, something absolutely extraordinary. We have spent so long looking backward from our position of technological superiority that we sometimes make the mistake of imagining that human beings from 4,000 years ago were less intelligent than us, less organized, less capable of building complex things. They were not. They had exactly the same brain as us, with the same capacity for observation, for planning, for problem solving. And what they had built with that brain, in the centuries before the collapse, was a network of interconnected civilizations of a complexity that modern archaeologists and historians continue to discover with astonishment. The Akkadian Empire was the central piece of this world, founded by Sargon of Akkad around the year 2334 BC. It was the first true empire in the history of humanity in the modern sense of the word, a centralized political entity that controlled an enormous territory, that had a permanent professional army, that collected taxes in a systematic way, that administered trade through routes connecting the Persian Gulf with the Mediterranean, and that had a real bureaucracy with written records, contracts, and official correspondence. The Akkadians had taken cuneiform writing, which the Sumerians had invented to record commercial transactions, and turned it into an instrument of imperial administration. We have clay tablets from this period that are letters between officials, military orders, harvest records, complaints from citizens to the authorities. They are documents you could imagine sending today by email. The distance between us and them, in terms of the sophistication of their institutional thinking, is much smaller than common sense would suggest. At the same time, in the Valley of the Nile, the old kingdom of Egypt was at its moment of greatest glory. The great pyramids of Giza had been built barely 2 centuries before the collapse, the beacon that humanity most viscerally associates with antiquity. Those structures that remain the largest ever built by human hands in all of history were relatively new buildings in 2200 BC. Egypt was an extraordinarily efficient state machine, with an irrigation system that allowed it to feed millions of people in a desert, with a priestly class that functioned as a repository of scientific and astronomical knowledge, with an active trade network that brought cedar from Lebanon, copper from Cyprus, and lapis lazuli from Afghanistan to the banks of the Nile. It was, in every important sense, a superpower of the Bronze Age. And further east, in the Indus Valley, there existed something that even today is difficult to fully comprehend. The cities of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, the capitals of what we call the Indus Valley Civilization, were in 2500 BC 2 of the largest cities in the world. They had an estimated population of between 20 and 50,000 inhabitants each, at a time when most human settlements on the planet were villages of a few hundred people. They had streets laid out at right angles, with a precision that required centralized planning. They had sewage systems and baths with running water that would not reappear in Europe until the Roman Empire, 2,000 years later. They had communal granaries of monumental proportions. And the most mysterious thing of all, we have no evidence of palaces, of royal tombs, of representations of rulers. It was, at least in appearance, a civilization without visible pharaohs or kings, which implies a level of egalitarian social organization that no other culture of antiquity achieved in such a sustained way. This entire network of civilizations, this system of systems that modern historians have begun to call the first globalization, was interconnected in ways we are only beginning to understand. The lapis lazuli that appears in the treasures of Egyptian tombs came from Afghanistan, which means that a trade route of more than 3,000 miles existed connecting the Indus Valley with the Nile Valley. The tin needed to make bronze, the alloy that gives the entire era its name, came from sources that in some cases were thousands of miles from the places where the metal was worked. Akkadian commercial agents lived permanently in Anatolian cities, functioning in a manner very similar to what we would call commercial embassies today. This world was integrated. It depended on its connections, and that dependence, as we are about to see, was exactly what made it so vulnerable. Before we continue, I need you to pause for a moment and write to me in the comments what is surprising you most about the story so far. Did you know that this network of interconnected civilizations existed 4,000 years ago? Or did you have the image of that period as a series of isolated cultures with no contact between them? Write to me because I am genuinely interested in knowing where each person who watches this video is starting from. And your comment also helps the algorithm carry this story to more people who need to hear it. Write to me down below. The collapse began, according to the most recent archaeological data, around the year 2200 BC, and extended over approximately a century. In the past 2 decades, thanks to advances in the analysis of polar ice cores, lake sediments, and speleothems, which are the mineral formations that grow inside caves and that act as climate archives of extraordinary precision, paleoclimatologists have been able to reconstruct the global climate of 4,000 years ago with a level of detail that would have been impossible 30 years ago. And what that data shows is consistent, disturbing, and relevant in ways that go far beyond ancient history. Around the year 2200 BC, the world experienced a period of severe and sustained drought that scientists call the 4.2 kilo-year event, in reference to the 4,200 years of age of the phenomenon. This drought was not the same everywhere. It was devastating in the regions that were already arid or semi-arid, exactly where the main civilizations of the time were concentrated: Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, the Mediterranean Levant. The drought lasted between a century and a century and a half, which means that several generations of people were born, lived, and died in a world of growing scarcity without having known the abundance their grandparents took for granted. The effects on the Akkadian Empire were documented by the Akkadians themselves with a precision that is chilling. There exists a literary text from the era, one of the oldest we preserve, called the Curse of Akkad, which describes the collapse of the empire in terms that historians, for a long time, interpreted as poetic metaphor, but that modern archaeology has confirmed were literal description. The text speaks of fields that no longer produce grain, of dry irrigation canals, of abandoned cities, of people eating their own children to survive. Excavations at the city of Tel Leilon, in present-day Syria, which was one of the most important cities of the Akkadian Empire, found a layer of arid sediment several centimeters thick that corresponds exactly to the period of the collapse. Below that layer, a thriving city with evidence of active trade, sophisticated craftsmanship, and dense urban life. Above it, silence. The city was abandoned and not inhabited again for more than 300 years. 300 years of silence over what had been one of the centers of the world. In Egypt, the collapse of the Old Kingdom followed a slightly different, but equally devastating pattern. The texts of the First Intermediate Period, which is what historians call the chaotic centuries that followed the collapse, are some of the most anguishing in all of Egyptian literature. The writer Apur, whose text we know through a later copy, but which specialists place in this period, describes an upside-down world in which the poor have taken over the wealth of the rich, in which the social order has completely collapsed, in which the Nile no longer floods with the regularity that guaranteed the harvests. What archaeology confirms is that the Nile did indeed experience insufficient flooding during this period, which in the Egyptian economy that depended absolutely on those floods to fertilize the fields, was just as catastrophic as the direct drought was for Mesopotamia. The Egyptian state, which had coordinated the work of tens of thousands of people to build the pyramids, lost the capacity to maintain that coordination. Power fragmented into the hands of regional governors. The pharaoh stopped being the omnipotent god that the system required to function, and became an increasingly empty symbol. But here's where the story becomes more complex and more revealing than a simple story of climate disaster, because the 4.2 kilo-year event, as devastating as it was, cannot on its own explain the simultaneity and the depth of the collapse. The climate was the trigger, but the system was already configured to fail in ways that the climate simply accelerated. And those ways have a resonance with the world we live in today that is impossible to ignore. The civilizations of the Bronze Age had built their prosperity on growing specialization and ever-increasing interdependence. Mesopotamia produced surplus grain, but had no timber or metals. Anatolia had metals, but depended on Mesopotamian grain. Egypt produced papyrus and linen, but needed cedar from Lebanon to build ships. The Indus Valley had cotton and advanced manufacturing techniques, but participated in the metal exchange networks that extended all the way to the Mediterranean. Each node in this network depended on the others for access to resources it could not produce locally. And when the drought struck the most vulnerable nodes, especially those of Mesopotamia and the Levant, the chain reaction propagated throughout the entire network at a speed that no communication system of the era could anticipate or coordinate to counteract. There was no central bank that could inject liquidity. There was no supranational institution that could coordinate the response. There were no strategic reserves sufficient to absorb a shock of that duration. The system was efficient under normal conditions and fragile in exactly the degree to which it was efficient. The same specialization that made it productive made it vulnerable. What happened after the collapse is in a certain sense just as fascinating as the collapse itself. The world did not end. If you made it this far, you already understand something that most people who discuss climate collapse, the fragility of global supply chains, and the concentration of economic power in a few interdependent nodes rarely connect to its deeper historical context. The collapse of the year 2200 BC was not an anomaly of ancient history. It was the first documented instance of something that the human system has produced several times since then, and that the conditions of the 21st century make possible in ways that academics who study systemic collapses have been warning about for years. Not to produce panic, but to produce exactly the opposite. The understanding that systems that collapse are always systems that could have been designed differently. And that is the only useful lesson that history offers. Not fear of collapse, but knowledge of its conditions. Before you go, I need you to write to me in the comments your answer to this question. Do you think the world of today, with its global economic interdependence, its supply chains connecting entire continents, and its dependence on fragile systems like the internet and electricity, is more or less vulnerable to the kind of cascading collapse that destroyed the civilizations of the early Bronze Age? There is no correct answer. There is evidence in both directions, and I want to know what you think. Write to me down below. And if you want to keep understanding the world in a way that the news does not give you, the next video is waiting with another story that connects the most distant past with the most immediate present. See you there.